Welcome everyone to our In Focus BU webinar, Wellbeing in the Updated Approved Learning Frameworks. I am really excited about this conversation we're going to have today. But just before we get started, I'd like to invite you to stay online with us after the webinar to continue the conversation about wellbeing in the updated frameworks and perhaps have some of your questions. We can have a bit more of a conversation with some of your questions asked. Some background information about BU, some of you may already know, but BU is a national initiative led by Beyond Blue in partnership with Early Childhood Australia and Headspace and funded by the Australian government. BU's vision is to transform Australia's approach to supporting children and young people's mental health in early learning services and schools. The BU vision is that all learning communities are positive, inclusive and responsive, a place where every child, every young person, every educator and their families can achieve their best possible mental health and wellbeing. Being part of the BU community means that your early learning service, school or school aged care service has access to BU consultants, which is part of the resource that BU offers. And they can really assist you to engage with BU, including thinking about your planning and actions. And I think this conversation today is also going to support some of that as well. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Kaurna country. I'd like to pay respects to Kaurna elders past and present. Sorry, someone's just telling me I'm not sharing, but I think perhaps I am. So I'm going to start again because I really want to acknowledge that I'm meeting on Kaurna country and pay respects to Kaurna elders past and present, and acknowledge that we are meeting across the country and pay respects to elders past and present from wherever you are, and I'd like to encourage you to join on the chat. Right. So just before we kick off and get sorted, some people are saying they can't see the screen share. So I just want to check that that's occurring or not, but just sort out the technical. It's not happening. All right, let's get that sorted. So you can only see me apparently. Now, what about that? Great. Off to a flying start. Fantastic. So let's move on to getting ourselves familiar with the space now that, let's actually do that and then we'll go back to this one. So we're in this Zoom meeting, which now we can all see, which is great. And I will introduce you to our two guests in a moment, but we'll just do this housekeeping stuff first. So this is a Zoom webinar, and on the screen you'll see a whole range of ways to make sure that you're set up and organised. We really encourage you to use the chat function to talk with each other. There is also a Q&A option where you can ask your questions as well. So we have our team in the background helping support that, and I'd like to acknowledge Dino, Nathan, Maria, Karina and Marie, who are helping in the background, and you'll see some of them in the chat today. If you've got any IT questions, you can ask them in the chat as well. So let's also, as we talk about mental health and wellbeing in today's conversation, it's really important to acknowledge that sometimes some feelings can come up, and we really want to make sure that this is a safe space for everybody. So really encourage everybody to take care of yourselves and each other. And on the screen, you'll see some support services. So if you do feel like you need some extra help, use the chat, find a friend, access the supports you usually use, or you can access one of these external chat supports as well. So let's get into the session itself. I am super excited to be introducing Jennifer and Faye to have our conversation about the wellbeing, about how wellbeing is positioned and represented and expressed in the updated approved learning framework. So I think I'll hand over to you first, Faye, to introduce yourself. I know Jennifer and Faye have been overseas recently, but on some exciting adventures, but I'm sure they've got lots of other things I'd like to share about who they are and why they're here today.
Thanks, Sarah. All right. Hi, everybody. Great to see so many people joining us today. So my name is Associate Professor Faye Hadley, and I'm joined with my amazing colleague, Associate Professor Jennifer Cartmell, to share with you today in the webinar. We were a part of the consortia that led the updates of the learning framework. So there were 6 of us in the key writing group. So that was also Professor Linda Harrison from Macquarie University, like myself, Professor Susan Irvine, who's from QUT, as well as her colleague, Dr. Frances Bobajani Harris. And Frances is a South Sea Islander and Torres Strait Islander person, so it was fantastic to have her as a part of our key writing team. And also Professor Lenny Barblett, who was on the other side of Australia, for those of you, and I saw there was a few people on the West Coast, so well, hello to all the West Coast, and I'm sure you know Lenny. She's very famous on that side of the world of Australia. So the 6 of us worked with 6 key writing buddies, just so for those of you who don't know, just so that to do the updates of the learning framework. So everything that you see that in the new framework, so the version 2 frameworks, were passed by our 6 writing buddies who are practitioners and work directly in early childhood or outside school hours care services. So Jenny, did you want to add anything to that?
No, hello everybody. So Associate Professor Jennifer Cartmell. I was very fortunate, like Dr. Linda Harrison, to be part of the version 1 of the frameworks. And so it was really exciting for me to have the opportunity to work on the updates and to work on both updates this time, to particularly contribute to the My Time, Our Place framework that I had invested in previously, and then also look at the early years learning framework. And I think that's one of the really key things that we really looked at when we were updating both frameworks at the same time. I think wellbeing was a really important thread that threaded through the early years learning framework into My Time, Our Place. And wellbeing encompassed not only what we put into the framework, but how we looked after ourselves as a writing team, as a consortium, as we engaged with the pilot. So it was something that was always foremost in our minds as we undertook this task. So we're really pleased to share bits and pieces of it today.
That's fantastic, Jennifer, and thank you, Faye, as well. And I think that's really the message we try and talk about here at BU. You can learn about this mental health and wellbeing, but it's also making sure you do it and take care of yourselves. And so educated wellbeing is as important and sits alongside of the when we're considering the wellbeing of children as well. So, and one of our aims for BU is that people increase their mental health literacy. So we become more aware of what we're talking about. What does it mean? And I'm going to be really interested today to have a bit of a conversation about, because in BU we talk about mental health and what are the similarities and differences between mental health and wellbeing. But I'm jumping ahead. So looking forward to that conversation today to talk about all things wellbeing in the now, let's just get this language clear, the updated approved learning frameworks, and we are going to talk about both early years learning framework and the framework for school age care. And that's been a really important consideration for us in this conversation. So we're going to talk about both of them. So we're going to call them the updated, or they're not new. That's one of the important messages, right? It's not new, it's the next version. Okay, so we're going to start with a poll though, and ask people in the chat or joining us today live if they already consider and plan intentionally for mental health and wellbeing in their practice or in their pedagogy or at their service. So Maria, can you launch the poll? And while we're doing that, because people can do 2 things at once, I also will want to let you know that there's a downloadable resource handout that's going to be posted in the chat that you can take away with your team, and there'll be some important information for you to think about there. Also, post of webinar, you'll receive the recording and the handout. And on Wednesday, the 11th October, we're going to host a BU Spotlight, which is something that we offer as a regular part of BU. But this is a follow-up opportunity, much more interactive than this webinar, where we're kind of more going to be talking at you. But this is an opportunity to talk together with people who've attended this webinar to really talk about some of the issues, because I think this is an ongoing conversation. It's not just a one conversation. We need to keep talking about this, and what does it look like, and what does this mean, and how do we do this in practice, and what does it mean for us, and what does it mean for children and families. So that spotlight will be an opportunity to do that. So you'll get that in the chat as well, the opportunity to register for that too. So how are we going with this poll? Looks like we can't vote, Maria. I was going to put mine in.
So was I, Sarah. I was thinking that well-being was something that I always am so conscious of thinking about all the time.
And it's interesting because we've been really talking about the difference between self-care, you know, having a bubble bath and, you know, looking after, you know, maybe going for a walk after work and those kind of things, which are important too. But what are those more structural things? What are the things we can put in place? What's workplace self-care look like? And how do we do things differently and think about things differently? And it's everybody's responsibility, right, Jennifer? Like, you know, it's my job, but it's our job together as well. And I think that's a really important message too. Are we done, Maria? Can we have a look at the results? Excellent. Right. So this is interesting. So most people do something. There's a big group that do often and sometimes, but not always. That's interesting, which is different from what you said, Jennifer.
Well, that's me that always, but I was going to say that's one of the reasons if we start to look at the update in the approved learning frameworks and look at the outcomes there, it was outcome 3 that was the one that really we worked hard on to make sure that we increased the information around wellbeing in that outcome. So I'm hoping that after people have got into using the updated framework, that when we ask this question in 12 months' time, Faye and I are really hoping that people are nearly on the always is looking so much stronger, because we're hoping that the emphasis that's placed in outcome 3 around that strong sense of well-being and that extra focus on physical and mental well-being, that people will really start to embrace and think about it more often.
Yeah. And that's a good segue to the first question. So we might close the poll. Thanks everybody for contributing, and keep talking in the chat if you've got other thoughts or questions about that. But I guess that is probably the first question to ask. And because outcome 3 we already had wellbeing in it. Well, outcome 3 already talked about wellbeing. But I guess what we, you know, to start off, you know, why is there an increased emphasis about wellbeing in outcome 3, but also throughout the frameworks? So what was the influences of that in terms of the writing group?
Sure. Do you want me to go first,
Yes,
Jennifer? We haven't practiced who goes first, but we have.
You jump in. That's great.
Okay. So just so for those that don't know the whole background of the update, it was led by all the education ministers, the state, territory and Commonwealth education ministers. And ASEQA were the people that held the money and then looked for somebody to lead that project. But we were already given a very strict timeline, a strict outline of what needed to be done. But also one of the key things was the terms of reference that guided what we could look at and what we couldn't look at. And one of the terms of reference was specifically asked us to look at the findings and recommendations from the relevant Productivity Commission reports, but also inquiries plus the Royal Commission into sexual assault and abuse. So that was a really key term of reference that then required us to look at mental well-being and health and development and how we support children and young people and how we keep them safe, and what do our 2 frameworks, the EYLF and My Time Our Place, need to be thinking about. The other thing in stage 1, which was also set out, we were asked to do a literature review, and I know that literature review is going to be shared with you. That's on the ASEQA website and you can read it. And that goes into, we had to look at that particular area and look at what it is around mental, physical health and social competence, and what is the contemporary literature and research and evidence telling us that has happened in the last 12 years since the version 1s of these two frameworks, and what are those other things that we needed to consider. So then I don't think they're surprising if for most of us who've worked in early childhood and outside school hours care for many years. They were around trauma-informed practice. We're already doing a lot of that, and there's been a lot of training around that. So some of the things we're actually catching up also with the current practices that are already happening. It was around healthy lifestyles and teaching protective behaviours. So we know that it's really that we need to teach children how to feel safe, how to communicate when they're not feeling safe, and how to be able to be heard and also listened to by their educators, so that we believe the children and young people when they are disclosing things around their personal safety. And then obviously stuff around executive functioning, again, the brain development, since the understanding of brain development since the first two versions were written has come a long way. So around executive functioning, how do we regulate, and emotional regulation and social emotional regulation, and that we know that these are skills that need to be taught. They're not things that we just know how to do when we're a young person, when we're experiencing these big emotions that we experience. And then around how to support and inform that practice. So I would encourage everybody listening in to go and have a look at the literature review and look at that particular aspect of the literature review, which is pages 22, 23 and 24. So that gives you a really clear understanding of what was informing what we were doing.
And Faye, what about the fact that we were living COVID?
Mm-hmm.
I think that was an added emphasis that not only were we reading about this literature and gathering all this empirical, evidence that it was really important, it was further compounded by the fact that we were, as a country, we were experiencing a really strong sense of, or a heightened awareness of our well-being. And so I think as we tried to connect with services to get feedback about what should be in the approved update, that very hands-on experience of caring for our well-being really prompted us to be really strong in what we said and how we shaped and included well-being in the frameworks. Wellbeing was always first and foremost part of the My Time, Our Place framework, because if you look at the two frameworks, the learning, development and wellbeing is the thread that's used in the early years learning framework, and then wellbeing, learning and development is in the My Time, Our Place framework. And so we know that children, as they are approaching school or they're leaving school in the afternoon, the outside school hours care services play a very significant role in the wellbeing. And so you'll notice that in the wording there is a much stronger emphasis, because it's the first word in that thread, but it's in some ways of no lesser importance between the two frameworks.
It's interesting, isn't it, that broader context that you were talking about too, Faye, and the immediate context that you were talking about, Jennifer, because that is something that we've found in with BU too. BU's been going for about 5 years now, building on from Kids Matter, but the increasing demand for educator wellbeing and understanding that goes along with us knowing more and understanding what about children's well-being. And I was really interested, Faye, you talked about the intentional teaching of some of those skills and social well-being and emotional well-being. In BU we use the term mental health, but and we'll have a conversation about that in a minute, I think. But both of those things require skills to help us be able to learn how to look after our well-being and know what it looks like. And we're in BU, I said before, we talk about mental health literacy, and that's about educators understanding what those things are and what they look like and feeling confident. When you're literate, you confidently apply and use knowledge that you have.
Absolutely. And I think, sorry, Jennifer. I think, as educators, it's really important that we know when to tap out when we're not regulated, when we're feeling dysregulated, and being able to articulate that to our colleagues. And that's the beauty of working in early childhood or outside school hours care. We're not alone in a classroom. We have other educators and adults that can help us manage and support us when we're feeling heightened.
Now, skills of observation are so important in that area. We often talk about observing with all our senses, and I think well-being sometimes can be hidden. It's not always obvious. Sometimes it is obvious because the words that we use, but it's around our skin tone, our non-verbal language that's really, really important. And having educators that understand children's development and other educators' development is really important. So those observation skills that we have in this space are really, really important. And you need to know what you're looking for, and recognize those skills, those characteristics, those signs that people are doing really well and looking after themselves, or that they need some additional support.
Yeah, and just a plug for the BU Beatles or Bettles tool. So we have an observational tool that will help people think about that. And Bettles is an acronym, stands for behavior. This is going to test me. Someone put it in the chat. Our thinking, our emotions, our relationships, and our learning. So all of those elements, we already observing those, but those things are really key to our mental health and well-being. And being able to confidently observe, notice, record, discuss with each other about those things helps us really tap into what's helpful for children, and how we might be able to support good mental health, because that's the important part of this conversation too for us, is that this is a continuum, and you often have good mental health, and sometimes there are things that create challenges, and sometimes you need some more support. And actually, that's one of the questions we were going to ask you, was thinking about the terminology. Obviously, wellbeing is the term that's used most readily in the frameworks. Like I said before, we tend to use we will use the term mental health, but there's also language of mental wellbeing. Would you be able to talk to that at all? Faye, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, so I suppose it goes back to originally what we were asked to do, which was look at the contemporary literature and research. And when the literature that we reviewed really talked about that mental well-being, and so that's where it was originally drawn from, because you'll remember from version 1 we just talk about well-being, but the term mental has been added to that. And so that whole mental well-being, health and well-being strategy was also looked at. There was a whole framework that we were looking at around there. And we also we had an incredible consortia. So we had there was about 35 of us across Australia. And then we had what we would call our experts, our really incredibly wise council, and one of those wise council, that was their research area, and so we would draw on that expertise from the consortia in helping to guide us and think about what was the language we should be using and how should we be describing these terms in the updated learning frameworks. And also we talked to a lot of organizations. So for example, we talked we consulted with SNAKE and Reconciliation Australia. So there were multiple organizations across Australia, and there's no one term that's going to capture it. And so in the end, it's about trying to capture what we think the majority told us. So we did have to be driven by the data. It was a project that was designed around collecting people's feedback. And I know BU were amazing and sent us one of the 65 submissions that we got in the discussion paper, and that helped inform some more thinking around the updates. So that really was around how we came to that terminology. Jennifer, did you want to add anything?
I was just going to say that one of the thicker parts of the update is the glossary. And I think that's been a really important part. And no doubt next time when we update again, that glossary will expand a little further. But that was one of the key feedback that we got from people, was to make sure that people understood the terms, that there was a common language that we could use and had common meaning. And so when we were actually embedding the notion of wellbeing into the framework, one of the ways of doing that was actually in looking at the glossary and how we explained what we meant about wellbeing, what we meant about trauma, and what we meant about neuroscience, so that was helping to give that common language that we could have.
That's exciting, isn't it? It feels like a sophistication in our profession almost, to kind of be much more nuanced in our language, but also have that shared language as well. And one of the things I really found as an early childhood educator coming into BU is funded by the Department of Health. So the mental health is a health health language. Wellbeing tends to be more of an education language, and it's about reconciling that. And because I also went, oh, it's social and emotional skill development. That's all similar things, and so it's reconciling that in your mind and not saying, well, that's not this, and how to bring that together. Just you started talking about there, Jennifer, about embedding wellbeing in the updated learning frameworks. That was one of our questions. It's clearly embedded and not just in outcome 3, although that's been expanded a bit more. Do you want to talk a little? Would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
I was going to say it's actually, one of the practices that we tweaked was the holistic practice, and I think that we've tweaked it enough to reflect the fact that well-being is embedded across whatever you do. And when you start to look at the individual practices that are listed in the framework, and we've done some tweaking on those, that notion of holistic is really key, because when we start to speak about one of the practices or principles, we can't help but speak about the other. And so that's where well-being seems to be threaded really holistically through all those practices and principles. When we start to look at sustainability, including social sustainability, you can't help but think about well-being there. When you start, to think about inclusive, integrated, collaborative, all those things are terms that stretch out and engage with well-being.
And I would add the partnerships one, Jennifer.
Yeah.
So we've actually made that more specific around working with our colleagues from Allied Health, for example. And we believe that the vision kind of drives everything now, that the revised vision. And so if you read the first words of the first sentence of the vision is around promoting confident and creative individuals and successful lifelong learners. Again, you have to be to learn, we have to be mentally well and open and have a growth mindset and be willing to be challenged, be willing to make mistakes. So all of those things that we know are really important around our development of our mental and well-being and sense of well-being are embedded right from the beginning. And that was something that we really tried hard to do in the updated versions, because that was some feedback about how some bits were a little bit disjointed. So we really tried to think about the vision and then how that drove the principles and then how that drove the practices, and then that led to the learning outcomes. So we hope that people will actually go to the beginning of the updated versions and not just go to the back of the book, which seemed to be a bit of a practice before.
Yeah. And the other thing there is to the addition of physical well-being, and acknowledging that when we talk about mental health and well-being or mental well-being, that our physical and social well-being are so caught up into that. And so the addition of information about physical health and well-being was really important too.
And another one, Jennifer, within that, so the literature, the research is really evident that we know that children are less active, that they're less likely to be eating well. We know that screen time and things like that are impacting on their physical well-being. So that was something that was really important. But also we talked a lot about technology. So that is also in all of the learning outcomes and woven through, but in particular in learning outcome 3, about how to use that safely. So that ties into the safe organisations and thinking about children's personal safety. So there's lots of little nuances, I suppose. That wellbeing learning outcome was, as most people remember, the smallest one. If you looked at in terms of the thickness, it's now got 3 elements, not 2 elements, and we've expanded a lot of those descriptions of what it looks like for children and what it looks like for the educators.
It's because, Faye, there's the flip side to the use of digital technology and children's energy levels, because sometimes children are exhausted from the school day. And so that, particularly in outside school hours care, if we're looking at children's well-being, we actually want downtime. We don't want them, we do want them to slow down. We do want them to re-energize. And so I think that's really important in the updates of the framework, that you're going to notice that there's some the continuum that we is there around well-being. Sometimes you're busy, sometimes you're not, and those things balance out for different reasons. And so it is really important that people dive in there and have really critical conversations about what mental well-being really means for them and for their service and for their cohort of children, where they're positioned geographically, where they're located. All those kinds of things need to come into the conversation. And I think that's where it's really interesting in the outcomes section, where we say, put your own examples of your practice. We're hoping that people will really populate the outcome 3 with their own examples of how they support children's mental health and well-being, from that from the opportunities that they provide, but also with the lens of being a child safe organisation, and also with the lens of an understanding about children's life outside of the settings that they're involved in. Perhaps it's their home environment, how all those things come together. And in the outcomes this time, in our pilot program, we had those 16 sites and those key writing buddies all give us really rich examples of practice. And I think that people are going to find that when they read those examples in the outcomes section, they'll find that they're much broader, particularly in the My Time, Our Place framework. There's much more diversity in the examples that are provided there. And there's going to be even more diversity when people add their own examples of practice into those as well.
And that's what the continued conversation is. We need to keep talking about those things. What does this mean to you, and how do you do it, and what does it look like for you in your context with your cohort of children? You did segue beautifully to that, discussing about the pilot. And I guess the question we had about was how those pilot groups took the concept of well-being in their practice, and you talked about them providing some really great and perhaps more diverse examples. But was there anything from the pilot that influenced how well-being was presented?
Faye, you tell the stories where you visited.
Yeah. So we, as Jennifer said, we had 16 sites, and they had 6 weeks to pilot the updated learning frameworks, and they did an amazing job under COVID, bushfires, floods, the beginning of the year. Whoever tries something new in February and March in an early childhood and outside school hours care centre, crazy, but they did it because that was the timelines we were given. But it really was so interesting to see how they took this learning outcome 3 and focus on wellbeing and think differently about it, and notice children and notice what was happening in their setting. And this also linked nicely to the the play-based learning and intentionality outcome, as well as the assessment and evaluation recommendation practice that all 16 sites had to trial, because they were kind of seen as the 2 big changes by the steering committee. But we've got this incredible documentation. For example, a little child who's very upset because they're in an infant's room, in a baby's room, very upset because they've just been dropped off and are crying. And the little Todd's over, all of maybe 15 months, and just sits next to this baby, puts their hand on the shoulder of that baby, and just sat there and just was present with that young baby, and just said, "Mummy, come back, Mummy, come back, Mummy, come back." And just sat there until that young baby, that 6-month-old, was calmed down and started to self-regulate. So there were really powerful examples of how, not only how we do it as in educators doing this, but how other children are so attuned. They're attuned to their peers, and they want to help their peers feel safe. And so that was a really great example of how that child was able to be empathetic and look after their peer. And they were all about 14, 15 months themselves.
Yeah. And in the outside school hours care sector, Sarah, there was a service that had a very busy day. The school day was really busy, and the outside school hours care was quite chaotic. And they took upon themselves to actually look at passive leisure and well-being. And so what they found was and people have probably seen some photos of those gorgeous green and blue beanbag chairs. And so what they did was they actually looked at their outdoor environment and provided more opportunities where children could sit and chat, where they could play games quietly outside. So outside wasn't just a space for running around, and the hall that they had wasn't just a space for running around. And so their focus on passive leisure really changed, and the programming and the planning, very careful planning of the environment, really changed the tone of that outside school hours care, where parents were really noticing that their children were much calmer in the afternoon when they collected them, where when I was there, a grandma had come to pick up her granddaughter, and the grandma ended up in the cushions chatting to the children, both her granddaughter and her granddaughter's friends, while they were putting on their shoes. So they actually stayed longer in the space, engaging and taking in the moment, which I think is really, really important for children to have that feeling of slowing down and know what that, being present feels like. So as Faye said, we had some really rich examples from the pilot sites of how they actually planned their interactions, changed their observations, and perhaps made modifications to their environments.
Can I tell one more story just
Yes,
from an early
please.
childhood perspective? Because I think this might resonate with the early childhood people listening in today. This is around your risk assessment of your environment. We all have to do it these days. We have to show our compliance around how we're using spaces. So this particular early childhood centre, while they were in the trial, they actually did a brainstorm with the children and talked about these spaces outside, which were risky play, set up for risky play, and brainstormed with the children about what would be the rules and how would they engage in this space and how would they make it safe. But by playing in it, and how would they be managing those risks? And that was all documented, and it was popped up for the families to see, and that then informed the way that the staff ran those particular parts of that outdoor area. So that speaks to the agency, which is a really strong part of the updated both frameworks, and another nice way of just really rethinking how you develop that thinking and give children those opportunities to guide and to lead the learning and to lead the thinking around what should be happening.
By another aspect of that where it's embedded, and from the pilot, in the outside school hours care and in the early years settings, the practice of assessment and evaluation. So assessment and evaluation wasn't actually new in the early years learning framework, but it was new to add assessment to the My Time, Our Place framework. And that's been a really good space to think about self-assessment, educator self-assessment. And so embedded in the description under the that practice is that sense of how are you as an educator, what is your well-being as you then go to observe or to engage in interactions with children, and saying first and foremost, if you're going to engage in assessment, it should be about yourself first, or about how you've set up the environment before you then roll out to look at how the children are interacting. And I think that's another important part of helping educators, administrators, management committees think about well-being in a more holistic way, because we're not just focusing on the children, we're actually focusing on the adults in that space and the interactions between the two.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? There's so many things you were talking about. I was like, oh, I want to add something there, but otherwise we'll go down rabbit holes we won't have time for. But that intentionality is really making me think about the intentionality and making sure that part of that is, who am I in this? What's my role? And then adding the well-being to that. Because we often think about some other things, our values and our beliefs that might influence our, our thinking or our how we do things. But then if we could add well-being to part of our intentionality. What am I aware of with my own well-being? And it might be in the moment, and we talk about mindful moments, or just, I remember one of the things someone told me, I was working in a toddler room, just started working, and someone said, just before, after you had your break, just before you walk back in the room, before you open the door, you have, that big deep breath, that whole body scan, and then you're ready to go back into the toddler room to, meet the beautiful chaos that's in there. But those mindful moments we can build in, that we can take responsibility for, but it's also really important that we do that together, and that it's not just each person's responsibility to take care of their own well-being.
And Sarah, I think people will notice, particularly in the early years learning framework, intentionality was in the My Time, Our Place framework, and the words intentional teaching were in the early years learning framework. And that's what, in this discussion around well-being, that's when we went, maybe it's more intentionality. Intentional teaching is a very narrow term, and often it's just applied to the adult, to the child, whereas working with intentionality recognizes that it's not only adult to child, but it's child to adult and child to child. And so we were excited when in reading the literature, that we could, take that up and go, okay, let's actually embrace the agency of everybody in this space. And we know that agency is really important to wellbeing by using terminology that really reflects good practice. Faye, I don't know whether you want to say anything about that, but it was a really important shift in thinking there.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with everything you said, Jennifer, around that, and that even though it was a little bit of a shift, and it wasn't a huge shift, it did change in the pilot sites. We saw quite significant changes in the ways that the educators were noticing things, what they were planning for, and how they were reflecting as a team about what it should look like, could look like.
That's interesting, isn't it? Perhaps finish
Sarah,
off.
I was just going to say, in the pilot sites, we and actually in the whole project, from woe to go, in the way in which we collected information, in the way in which we shared, we actually saw this shift in thinking about the work of the approved learning frameworks as being something that adults do to children, to become something that adults and children do together. And there was actually a really huge shift in thinking about how are children situated. And when we started to have conversations, when we began meetings, it was children first. And then we started to talk about the adults' work in that circumstance, and not detracting from the fact that we need to consider educators' well-being, but just really putting children first really helped people to think a little bit differently about who's going to benefit from this experience and how are they going to benefit. So it was that was a really exciting shift to see people really, as Faye said, notice children a whole lot more.
And I still love Nate's quote. So as most people know, we talk to children and young people at every stage of the project and fed back to them what we'd learnt from them. But Nate said he was for, I know stuff. I wish my teacher would ask me stuff because I could tell them lots of stuff. So that was a particular summing up of just listen to us, ask us. We'll tell you what we think and what we value. And they're not things that are unsurprising to a lot of people. It's around relationships. It's around their peer groups. It's around them having choices and being able to go outside when they want to go outside, and all of these things that are linked to their agency and their drive. But it just reminded us that we and our educators in the pilot sites, that was one part that they did in week 6 was talk to the children, and that really did allow them to start to think differently about their programs.
It makes me think about what kind of amazing conversations you could have about well-being with children, and the knowledge that they would have already about regulating and we were talking before, and you both gave really fantastic examples of co-regulation. Like, that's so critical for help seeking behavior. If to be mentally healthy, you need to be able to ask for help, and that means helping each other together, not just going off and doing it by myself. And so that whole notion of being together and doing things together and co-regulating, but also, you know, children know how to do that. That 18-month-old child knew how to do that without any words. And I think, you know, if we could apply that thinking and that intentionality around and well-being, and then start having conversations with children about well-being, they're going to teach us so much about what's possible and what they care about.
Yeah. And I think it also helps educators' own well-being, because even though Faye said there's usually somebody else in the room, it still is a fairly it can be a very lonely journey, you know, or that sense of responsibility. Here am I'm responsible for 4, I'm responsible for 10, I'm responsible for 15 children, you know. And I think knowing if educators can see themselves as working in partnership with children, I think it really helps them to think about how they can support children's mental health and well-being, because you're actually giving them the confidence to be intentional with each other, and you're giving them the confidence to be open and transparent with educators, which then makes the educator's role so much easier because you've got this open, transparent, deep conversation happening with all players in the space. But it's for educators, sometimes it's to have the confidence that that's what you can do.
Yeah, the permission giving almost. And I guess that's what having an increased presence of wellbeing in the learning frameworks now might help people to feel like it's okay to do that. We had a really interesting webinar, the last one we did with Tamara Cummings from the workplace wellbeing, you know, and the pressures that people feel that are around, you know, but I think, you know, grounding ourselves in our work with children is in the ways that you were just describing there, Jennifer, really helps to balance out some of those things that are the reality of and COVID's added to that, I think. And you know, that we can't deny what life is like and what this work is like.
And so I always head people to page 18, which is the critical reflection and ongoing learning. Faye knows that I say, if you're going to start to read the framework, don't start at page 1. Faye likes the vision. I like the ongoing learning and reflection. Maybe read the vision and then read the ongoing learning and reflection. There's a series of questions there that are really helpful for people to have conversations with each other. And the questions there that are on page 18 are asking people to describe how they're feeling, what they're challenged by, what they're curious about, and how it links to contemporary theories and practice. And that's where the literature review comes in. And then it says, how are we going to practice, and who's going to benefit, and how will they benefit? And I think that final question, you know, who's silenced, who's advantaged, that kind of final question gives people permission to think differently and to actually take on board what sometimes they might be feeling inside but don't have the confidence to do. So those questions are in the critical reflection and ongoing learning. And notice we've flipped that wording. It used to be ongoing learning and critical reflection, and we flipped it to be, if you engage in critical reflection, then you can engage in ongoing learning. And so that's a great place to use to have a discussion about wellbeing.
Did you want to add anything, Faye?
No, we all have our favourite bits of the
It's so interesting you said that, Jennifer, because that's my favourite bit, and it was my favourite because that was in the, you know, who's advantaged, who's disadvantaged. Yeah. That has always been my favourite bit, and it's interesting, isn't it, because we can get a bit overwhelmed with all of the things, and it's being it really, and this is where that intentionality comes back, I guess. You know, you have to make a decision sometimes, and some people will benefit from that decision, and some people won't benefit in the same kind of way, or that might disadvantage them, some children or others. It's about being aware of that and knowing that that's what's happening, and being mindful of that in the bigger picture as well. So it is what happens. But yeah, that's my favorite bit too. So I'm so excited to hear you.
And it links really nicely to the collaborative leadership and teamwork. I think that is a new principle, and it really does allow educators to, well, it gives permission for the team to be working together, to be collaborating. It is also beyond just educators. It is about working and collaborating with the children, collaborating with the families, and collaborating with your community. So making it context specific. But that's one of my favorites as well, in terms of allowing us to really think about this work and not think it's one person's job, because that's when we can get really overwhelmed and our mental health can be impacted, because we feel like we're carrying the weight or the responsibility of all of this work. Whereas that's one of the reasons I loved working in early childhood was because I was surrounded by an amazing group and a team that I could bounce ideas off and tap out if I needed to, or tap in if they needed to tap out.
Yeah, Jennifer, I was going to segue to that before, and then we went down, we talked about something else. So, Jennifer, did you want to add anything about the principle collaborative leadership and teamwork in particular in relation to this conversation about wellbeing?
So it was that kind of that knowledge was already in the My Time, Our Place framework previously, because we were so conscious that children aged 5 to 12 deserve to have that kind of connection. But I think we've strengthened it and looking at those broader partnerships too, and opening it up a little bit more to the community. I think that's one of the other interesting aspects. If we look at the exceeding themes in the National Quality Framework, and that's, and marrying that up to the fact that these frameworks belong in the National Quality Standard and the National Quality Framework, that sense of our settings being part of communities. And I think that was a really rich component of the pilot sites, as they demonstrated how they approach some of the principles and practices and the outcomes that they were trialing. They didn't just see it as an individual thing or just a class group thing. They saw themselves as part of that wider community, and how that community impacted on them. And I think that really demonstrated how we saw wellbeing not just in a little tight group, but cutting across our whole community, and why we really need to reach out and make sure that we're looking outside as well as looking in.
Faye, did you want to add any more to that? You segued us beautifully into that.
No, I would give an example of what Jennifer was saying, that it was in the pilot sites, but it was an educator talking to a father, and it was in the infant's room again. And the father was really concerned that the baby wasn't getting enough water over the day, because the cup was above the baby's, as we know, because they all like to drink out of each other's cups. So we make these decisions about keeping some of that a bit higher for them. But this educator documented and had a really beautiful documentation around how they had a conversation with the father about how they were attuned to that infant's signs, the different squeals that child made when they wanted their cup, the gestures that they made. So even though that they were pre-verbal in terms of language, they were able to read the cues, and that child was getting plenty of liquid over the day. That conversation actually allowed that father to rethink how they were reading the cues of their child at home. And they went away and said, and it wasn't a criticism of their parenting or anything like that. It was a really genuine, beautiful parent partnership kind of, connection. And they went away and said, okay, I'll have a think about this, and I'm going to look out for those signs at home, because I think maybe I was missing those. So again, just a really nice example of those ways that we can collaborate and communicate and have conversations with our families.
And Faye, what about the collection of the fruit from the neighbour's farm in the family daycare home, where the children engaged with an older neighbour and collected fruit from the fruit tree in the neighbour's yard, and then the children in the family daycare setting prepared the fruit to make jam, and then passed it back to that neighbour and to other members of their community as jam for them to use. And I think that's the breadth of examples in that collaborative collaborative leadership area is really important, because that's demonstrating that care, that sense of responsibility for other people in the community at that younger level. Is really important as role models for and opportunities to practice collaborative leadership, no matter what your age.
And speaks really nicely to the social sustainability principle as well. And, you know, we had another early childhood centre who was cut off by the floods. And so some of their children were unable to come over the bridge and go to their centre. And they knew that some of the community had lost their homes or lost a lot of their belongings from the flood. So the children initiated a food bank with conversations with the educators. So again, another example of broader understanding of our community, the trauma that they might be going through, and what can we do as a collective to support those children and families who have lost things in the flood. So there was some really nice synergies, and that's why I love the updated version, not just because we were a part of it, but I just think the principles and the practices all feed really nicely into those learning outcomes as well.
Sarah, if people haven't got an idea yet, we had a really good time updating the frameworks and being able to collectively share some of the really rich practices that people were using based on the principles across sites. And we really enjoyed gathering them up from the 16 sites. We shared them with each other. We shared them with the 16 sites, and then to embed them into the frameworks themselves, but also knowing that we were passing on frameworks that had space for people to put their own examples into there as well. I think that's a really, it was exciting for us.
Yeah, and it feels like it's really built on the intent of the frameworks in the first place. I mean, that was the intent, and how, again, reinforcing, and this has always been the case too, but how those principles and practices need to go together with the outcomes, and you can't just focus on the outcomes and jump straight to the back of the book, but you need to really think about the vision and the principles and practices. What are the underlying principles and what are the pedagogical practices? That's what they are. That's what they're called. And they're the things that drive and guide our work, and understanding what they look like too is really important. So we've got only a few minutes left, 5 minutes left. This is almost a little bit of a question without notice, but I'm going to ask you anyway. We've had a really great conversation about how wellbeing's kind of been integrated and raised up a bit more in the learning frameworks. I'm thinking about what as people become familiar and the changes, the frameworks get rolled out and people start practicing, because I think that's really important too, that this is an ongoing continuous improvement process. We can't be perfect and right first go, because that's not how things work. What will the changes in terms of wellbeing having a higher presence, what will they look like, sound like, and feel like, perhaps in individual learning communities or more generally in the early childhood, sector themselves? Have you got any thoughts about how it might be if we look into the future? You're nodding, Faye. Do you want to go first?
Sure. So Jennifer and I did talk about this a little bit before the webinar. So it's going to look different in different communities, because and that's the beauty of our two frameworks. They're not syllabus documents. They're frameworks. They guide our practice, and our practice needs to be guided by the children, the families, the colleagues that we have, and the community context that we're living in. So it will look different. So context does matter, but it will be. If you're embedding the principles and the practices and thinking about educator wellbeing as well as children and young people's wellbeing, you're going to have calmer classrooms. You're going to have safe spaces where children feel that they can come to you and talk to you. You're going to have educators who may feel a bit overwhelmed, be able to indicate that and have conversations with their leader or their room leader, so they're going to feel comfortable and safe and in a trusting space. It'll be fun, it'll be joyous. We use the words like love and awe and wonder in the learning outcomes and in those descriptions of what it could look like. It will look like that example that I told before about the young child, the 15-month-old help self-soothing not self-soothing, helping that baby start to co-regulate and think about them. It'll be like Jennifer said, the passive play. Like, I think that's just amazing. And I think there's an article, Jennifer, we should put the link in, because I think it's actually published now. And I'm sure the Outside School Hours Care people would love to read that article. Yeah. So it'll look like it is a part of your program. So there will be intentional teaching that is happening, intentionality. So, you know, spaces in your room may be set up where children can go, and if they're feeling angry or upset, able to express themselves, whether that's finding some pictures to be able to show, or to find, you know, crawl into that quiet space and just be by themselves because they're feeling overwhelmed. So it'll be in your environment as well. But Jennifer, I've probably talked enough. You go.
No, I was just going to say, Faye and I also discussed, some people have been a little concerned perhaps that there hasn't been some professional learning around the update to the frameworks, but they're only an update. And we already had BU in existence that could provide support. And so I think that the resources, the support that BU can offer, particularly, you know, for the whole framework, but particularly around outcome 3, is really important. And it's only a matter of people reaching out to access the wonderful resources that BU has, that you know, that can really help people to change, shift, feel more confident. So when you ask me what will it look like, I think it will be people using the resources of BU more than they have been in the past. So yes.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm not sure I can add any more to that. I think maybe a takeaway for me is that and I knew this, but this has reinforced this. This is an update. We already have a fantastic foundation that we're working on. I think, you know, that notion of intentionality and permission giving around well-being, so that people can really add that to the, yes, this is something I really need to pay attention to. Not just we know we need to, but I'd like to, but actually now it says I can. That's really exciting. And yeah, we are really keen for people to come to us at BU, and we've got the, you know, the resources. It's free. You can have access to a consultant. We have ongoing spaces, webinars like this, but also online spaces where you can have chats and conversations like we're going into in a minute, to ask your questions and continue the learning and do that critical reflection too that you were talking about, Jennifer. So I'd like to thank you both so very, very, very much for coming and having this conversation, sharing your knowledge of the process, but also your passion for the work. We really appreciate that. For both of you, thank you so very much. And we'll finish up. Thank you all, everybody else, for coming, and stay online if you'd like to answer some of the bit more juicier questions maybe. So thanks, everybody.